Welcome back, everyone, to another edition of Bad News brought to you by the Federalist and the National Journalism Center. I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
We are the media show, the media criticism show that the right deserves. We come to you every Wednesday and Friday to break down the bad news of the week. And by bad news, we mean the worst of the corporate media and the legacy media's coverage. There's plenty to work with. We could do this show every day for 5 hours. But here we are coming to you as often as we possibly can. Ben, I actually want to start on a really important topic, and this is one that Tom Bevan of Real Clear Politics did a great Twitter thread on that I'm going to put up on the screen here. It's really an incredible statement on how the Sunday shows, how far they've fallen. Something that we've talked about recently is that the media has always been biased. That is absolutely true. The media has 100% always been leaning to the left on a lot of issues, if not most issues. But and in certain definitely in terms of like partisan affiliation. But this is not your grandfather's Sunday shows anymore. As Tom points out, he actually did the calculations here. You can see right there, Chuck Todd devoted 43.5% of his program to the Cheney GOP dispute. That's compared to 5.3%, 2 minutes, to the conflict in the Middle East. It was just as bad on ABC's This Week with Martha Raddatz, according to Tom's calculations. 43% of the whole show goes to Cheney and the GOP dispute. But what on earth do you make of this?
Well, one of the reasons that this thread so resonated with me is because this is how I've felt about the Sunday shows for probably at least the last 5 years. And it just perfectly articulated kind of all the corruption and malfeasance associated with them. Sort of like, a reason why you should listen to NPR is to understand kind of what the progressive perspective is going to be on a number of issues. And they'll tell you how they're going to target wrong thinkers and what their policy priorities are. The Sunday shows have always been, but especially in the last decade or so, have become the most reliable indicators, I believe, of what the political class thinks the narratives ought to be and really what it prioritizes in terms of issues, in terms of who it thinks actually matters inside the Beltway. And once again, this shows the chasm between what I think all of our viewers probably think are the important issues of the day versus the clear political element of what all the Sunday shows cover. I mean, leaving aside the fact that it's pretty boring if they're all telling you the same thing every single week, week in, week out, and it's clear that it's partisan in its slant. What the tweets illustrate is that, again, these shows set the narrative, even if the narrative conflicts with actually what really matters from a substantive perspective. He also demonstrates who the guests are and the makeup, the ideological makeup of the panels, which are not at all representative of the country, of course. They always have the token conservative who's not really conservative or is, the kind of fiscally conservative, socially liberal, like the construct that exists pretty much only in Washington, D.C. for the most part. So I thought that the thread just captures so well, once again, the chasm between the ruling class and the people that it deigns to rule. And it also shows, of course, the growing irrelevancy, I would say, of the Sunday shows. I mean, I remember growing up, I grew up in a very political household, and every single Sunday, my family would flip between Meet the Press and Fox and CBS, Face the Nation and the like. But now, you just know that it's going to be political hatchet jobs, spinning the stories, slanting the narratives as such. And it makes them something of an irrelevancy, which is a shame, but the institutions have destroyed themselves. We haven't destroyed the institutions.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a really key point is the arc here, which is, again, as we've already reiterated, yes, these shows were always center left, but there's something different going on now in media when their entire bubble is never really penetrated, and that's because it sort of has the self-protective shield. They're actually like killing themselves by keeping voices of dissent out, which make the conversation much more interesting, much more productive, much more valuable to the audience. And the audience knows that. The audience knows that they're getting ridiculous coverage. And in this case, I mean, to basically elevate glorified Washington gossip when it comes to Cheney versus McCarthy, and that's what it is. And that's why these reporters love it. That's not to say it has no broader relevance and no national relevance. Of course it has some, but to dominate your show with 50+% coverage of Cheney versus versus McCarthy versus the GOP versus Joe Biden, whatever it is. That's insane. And that's something that it's a great example of how when you're biased because you live in Washington, D.C., and everybody's talking about Liz Cheney in Washington, D.C., and everybody has heard from this staffer and this staffer and this staffer, and the story feels so, fluid and important and immediate. It's only because you live in Washington, D.C. The rest of the country doesn't care about it. It's not super relevant to their lives. You can almost make the same argument some people would think about the Middle East, right? Like you could see some people being like, well, people in Kansas, what do they care about what's happening in between Israel and Palestine? Of course they care, first of all, because that's a lot of American money at play. That's an American ally. That's our strength in a really key part of the world. Their kids are the ones that go off to fight these wars when they do happen. And so to say, as that's roiling, that you're going to take 50+% of the show and dedicate it, your Sunday show where you're supposed to have politicians meet the press and talk about the most important issues of the day in that, hallowed forum, to dedicate 50+% to Liz Cheney while we have this happening in the Middle East, while we have the economy in the place that it's in. I mean, I get that that's not sexy, but we have the most sanctimonious people in the industry gathered in these forums every Sunday who claim to be the firefighters of our republic. And there they are, just obsessively covering glorified gossip.
Firefighters of the republic, but meanwhile, there are real fires going on, and their focus is try to play up a GOP civil war and who's going to be a loyalist to President Trump and who's going to be courageous and break from him because they don't want to actually talk about the substantive issues that don't look so good to their favorite politicians. That's the meta narrative that runs through this.
No, that's a great point. We have another topic, and this always happens. We always have everything sort of like it does flow together really well, and we don't even do it intentionally. But another example here of this not being your grandfather's legacy media. Here's a post from Jonathan Turley, who broke down the Washington Post's failure to check facts when it comes to the story about an alleged descendant of Robert E. Lee. Oh, here's from Turley. The Post ran a widely cited article on how Robert E. Lee's own descendant wanted the general statues to be removed. The problem is that no one at the Post appears to have actually checked to see if Reverend Robert W. Lee was an actual descendant. It now appears that he is not, according to Kessler. Glenn Kessler, of course. Well, and here's Turley. While Kessler strangely does not believe this warrants his signature Pinocchios. So that's, again, Glenn Kessler is the fact checker at the Washington Post who allegedly, calls balls and strikes as best he can, which is ridiculous. He's not giving any Pinocchios to his own paper, even though it seems to be in a situation where it could really use those Pinocchios. But here's a good example of just, again, this is not your grandfather's center-left biased legacy media. This is the lowering of standards because the narrative has gotten so strong that papers make mistakes. Reporters do things stupid, like forget to fact check or deliberately not fact check or just say this guy couldn't be lying. His name is Lee and he lives in Virginia or whatever. But in this case, I think when the narrative is so strong, you don't even pause to fact check because it's just assumed that you're operating on a factual basis with somebody who you think is doing something really good. And you don't even have that instinct or that impulse to take a second and think, maybe I'm getting had.
Yeah, especially in a time where we know that there's so many fraudsters out there and they're able to pull things off and create profiles of themselves publicly to create an impression of one thing that proves false. And yeah, there are really two elements to this that I think are telling. First, there's the clear media malfeasance, not doing their job, not digging into who this person is and can he verify his background. Because, of course, the narrative is just too juicy. It has to be put out there that here's the descendant of Robert E. Lee, and he's saying tear down the statues everywhere. And he, even in his responses, this Miss Reverend Lee, I think on social media, for example, has said, why is the media making such a big deal about my lineage? Essentially, it doesn't really matter if it's accurate but false. That his opinions are the valid ones, and they're the ones that should be out there. And so who cares really about the lineage or not, which sort of goes to the fake but accurate sort of way that the media loves to cover a lot of stories when they get called on hoaxes and people playing them and these sources that are not credible and the like. So one aspect is just, again, media malfeasance, pathetic errors that presumably would have never happened 30 years ago. Then the second element, though, which is broader, is we've talked about Kessler before and the kind of shameful, cringeworthy, bizarre story that he did about Senator Tim Scott's background. And the reason that I raise that is it would appear that maybe in Kessler's mind, and I'm not trying to play psychoanalyst here, but this is a way to try to make up for the deserved criticism that he got over that bizarre story by digging into the background of someone relating to, the Confederate par excellence, Robert E. Lee. So maybe this was a way that he thought he could redeem himself. Might be why he pursued this story. He just got a great tip.
Yeah, and I think we've done entire shows on the farce that is legacy media fact checking. It basically just gives them cover to be corrupt and incompetent, and but say, listen, we have fact checkers on staff, and occasionally we'll do something that is legitimate, and so they get away with, how many things has the Washington Post published that Glenn Kessler has never touched or never fact checked that are much more egregiously false than this story about a descendant of Robert E. Lee. But I think it is so interesting to think about a place like the Washington Post, since Ben and I work in media, to sort of pull back the veil a little bit. These stories go through rounds and rounds of editorial oversight. This is a big corporate outlet. They have layers of bureaucracy, and when things get published, it's not like a blog. It's not somebody just clicking publish on their blog spot. This goes through multiple rounds, and that means a lot of people looked over this. It means a lot of people either assumed the reporter did a fact check here and checked into the facts. The reporter lied, which I doubt. I mean, my best guess as to what happened here, and I would probably put money on this having happened, is that because when you're ideologically aligned with somebody and you think that their mission is your own mission, you just sort of will sometimes assume they're well-intentioned and assume they're doing something righteous and good, instead of saying, again, I'm a journalist. It's my job to hold people who come to me with information accountable and who are making public claims accountable. So this wouldn't have, I really don't think this would have happened a long time ago, more than a decade ago, because I think the standards have just fallen. And that's how all of those Russia collusion hoax stories got published. It's because they were taking uncritically, and we talked about this on Friday, tips from literal PR firms who were working with spies to place this information in the legacy media, because those standards have fallen due to this intense ideological bubble mentality, where you don't check out everything that aligns with your narrative because it's just sort of assumed to be true in your mind. Because of that, you get situations exactly like this one, where people are, left not checking basic facts. And I don't know, do you think something different happened? That's sort of my best guess here.
It may be. I could see it going that way. That seems like the Occam's razor explanation, which is usually the right one. And if I urge everyone, go and check out the New York Times corrections every day, because they are hilarious. Oftentimes, there's one that I've flagged a couple of times that I go back to, where they got the Bloods and the Crips mixed up in a story about gangs and the colors that they were wearing.
Don't want to do that.
Yeah, you definitely don't want to make that mistake. So, look, there is just rank incompetence at times and ignorance. But to your point, a place like the Washington Post, they spend lots of money to build in lots of layers of folks who are supposed to be able to sniff out these issues. And to the extent there was just an assumption of legitimacy or veracity of the reporter, just like there was assumed veracity of Christopher Steele, that's a major problem. You can't make that assumption. You're failing at your duty if you make an assumption like that. And we, the consumers of that media, are the ones who pay the price for it. And just to close the loop on the Russiagate thing, it's a good reminder, and maybe we should do all of Friday's episode on this. The article out in the New York Times, feature article, which is an excerpt from a book, which talks about essentially the collapse of the Russiagate narrative, particularly with respect to the Steele dossier or dossiers and Steele's reportage and Fusion GPS. And that article essentially says the media got this wrong and will not really be held to account for it unless it does X, Y, and Z. It also, the place where I take issue with that article, which is a must read. I mean, it really does go through in great depth the layers of screw ups that happened, but it ascribes them in part to the media being manipulated by private investigators, spies, these shady sort of oppo research firms comprised of ex-journalists in many cases, and essentially says the media got played and manipulated. I would not let the media off, because I think that there were way too many red flags for that to have been the case. And the fact that they continued to cling to the narrative even after it collapsed, I think further demonstrates that this was something that they were politically attached to. But I would urge everyone to read that article, because it does show the major media malfeasance with respect to the Steele dossier and the inside baseball as to how that narrative was foisted on us.
And again, what this gets to is just the devolution of standards that have come along with the ideological monopolization of the legacy press. And again, I mean, this is the third thing that we wanted to discuss today. And I agree, Ben, I think we should just make the decision right now. Friday's show should be about that article, which I think is an excerpt from a book that I expect will have a lot of interesting information in it. So here's a tweet from Stephen Miller: "Why everything is going fine," from the Washington Post. Late night tweets were a weekly national crisis, but inflation is nothing to worry about. And you can see two headlines of tweets from the Washington Post there. "When everything is a crisis, maybe some of them aren't. Inflation is up. The stock market is down. Here's why you shouldn't panic." Again, this gets to framing. It gets to something that I think this is like something that's been happening for years. So to the point actually that we were making earlier about how some things are sort of have a rich legacy in the legacy media, some of the center left bias. This is one of those things. This isn't new. I would argue that it's intensified, but like this is one of those old staples of media bias where you're framing something a Democratic president does very differently, if subtly, from something that a Republican president does. And you would have to be paying close attention to really notice that. It's one of those things that'll just sort of seep into your average reader's consciousness, right? That like you're just sort of conditioning people subtly to see Republicans as bad and Democrats as good. And most Republicans are probably aware of that, and especially so now. That's one of the things that Donald Trump, love him or hate him, absolutely solidified on the right. So basically this is something that's been happening for years. But in this case, when you're talking about how the Post is going to frame inflation as don't panic, we don't have a crisis on our hands. But every Trump tweet was a crisis for the Republic. I mean, come on. And this is sort of what we knew would happen in the Biden era. But it's a good example of how poorly they handled the Trump era.
Yeah. And like you said, this is commonplace. This is what we've come to expect. And maybe it inadvertently reveals that the Post understands that the Post readers aren't going to be affected by the devaluation of the dollar and the rising costs of everything that most Americans actually have to deal with, and that this is effectively a massive tax on Americans when the costs of all the basic materials that go into everything that we use is skyrocketing, and consequently that price gets passed on to us. It's a pretty big darn deal, as Joe Biden would say, big effing deal. And the fact that they don't want to cover it, but everything was a crisis on the other side. Once again, this should destroy their credibility. It doesn't destroy their credibility because they're sort of preaching to the choir. I think what it illustrates, in fact, is that they know, they being ruling class effectively in corporate media, its communications arm broadly, knows that they can't ignore price inflation. It is a real story. There are real consequences to it, to the American people. It's a regressive tax, really, at the end of the day. In order to cover it, the best that they can say is, don't believe what you're actually seeing. It's not really a crisis. All will be well. And, I just think of all the different gifts that work so well to exemplify what they're trying to say here. All is well as the world is burning behind them. And again, maybe for them, all is well. There are people who do benefit from massive money printing, and it's the kind of people who own papers like the Washington Post. But it's not the people at the end of the day who comprise the mass of the American people. And so this is the best that they can say, essentially, about a disastrous economic situation. And it reflects a massive policy failure and the fact that they don't really have a way that they can genuinely message about it. It's propaganda, plain and simple.
Yeah. One point one thread to just pull at quickly is something you said is really interesting and something we talk about a lot, which is, on the one hand, if you can afford a Washington Post subscription, maybe inflation isn't a crisis for you. And if you are a reporter working for the Washington Post, maybe inflation doesn't feel like an immediate crisis to you. And that's sort of a good example of how these publications like the Post and the Times in the sort of democratized and fragmented media landscape continue to purport to cover the entire country, but speak increasingly only to themselves and people like them. And that's only going to get worse. It's something that we see at the New York Times. Like, they don't have to provide fair coverage of Republicans anymore, even though they purport to. That's actually not what their audience wants. Why did they revoke the Tom Cotton op-ed? Do you think it's because those editors at the New York Times, some of whom have been in this industry for years and years and years, thought that that was actually putting Black New York Times staffers in danger? Do we really think that's what they believed? No, it's because their subscriber base wanted to see them do that. And this is just going to get worse as the media gets more and more fragmented. Something definitely to pay attention to. Ben, why don't we close by taking a question here? You can see it up on the screen. Are those without Twitter capable of knowing the alternative of the legacy media, Fox notwithstanding? So I would say the answer to this question is increasingly yes, and maybe that's too easy of an answer, but anyone who's getting Substacks forwarded to them, Substacks from great people like Abigail Schreier, Matt Taibbi, people who are doing really good journalism, Michael Tracy, who, by the way, Michael Tracy had a Substack post last week that was really, I think, that was very much something that a lot of people who have aligned with him on the right would disagree with, and it was a big challenge to the right on Israel, and it's a good example of, like, that's fine. And people on the right aren't going to get upset about Michael Tracy calling them hypocrites when it comes to that. They'll actually probably think about it because we're more conditioned to do that because we exist in this world where we're constantly challenged on our ideas, as opposed to the left, which sort of insulates itself in these coastal bubbles. I should say the people in media on the left. But it's a good example. And so I think the answer is yes. I mean, get on Substack. You don't have to be on Twitter. You can be watching us right now on Facebook and listening to us recommend some of these people's Substacks. You can start reading websites like The Federalist, which, people would probably be surprised how often, is read by people that aren't just on the right, just normal people around the country. So I think the more that outlets like The Federalist and even like the Daily Wire pop up, the more, you won't just have to be one of the very few Americans who's actually on Twitter to get news sources from scrappy independent outlets.
Yeah, so what I would say is there's never been a broader proliferation of content that covers whatever worldview you might have and that you can access as easily and cheaply and quickly as you can today. At the same time, the algorithms that basically govern our life push us towards the sources that our friends, peers, family, neighbors, colleagues look to. And then also, to some extent, based upon what we search and what we read ourselves, tend to lean towards. So, I think that people who are in ideological bubbles may be in greater ideological bubbles than they've ever been before, even though there's a broader spectrum of, there's a huge world out there that might have never existed in the past. There aren't 3 networks on TV and 5 radio stations. There's more diversity than ever before. And if you want to seek out competing views on anything, well, until they get, deplatformed and canceled and blacklisted. And of course, Google, of course, biases the search rankings and the like. So to be fair, it is getting increasingly more constricted, but nevertheless, as you said, Substack is a platform with an independent voice. There are so many different streaming programs out there, podcasts and the like. And again, the legacy incumbent institutions want to destroy these entities precisely because they want to maintain their monopoly or oligopoly on narrative and their business models as well. So there are kind of competing forces of, on the one hand, more choice than ever before. On the other hand, people being more siloed potentially than ever before. And then the last point I'll make on it, which also is another layer of the challenge here, is that even if you shut out so-called mainstream media out of your daily life and you were just operating in the world of kind of entertainment and pop culture, of course, entertainment and pop culture are an extension of the legacy media. They put forth more radical narratives, shift the Overton window, and do it through storytelling and humor and entertainment rather than so-called straight news. So that is one of the challenges, I think, in our society, is how pervasive the narratives are in the influential platforms out there. But on the other hand, there's a whole wide world out there, and it's really incumbent upon everyone to try to push their peers to look at other sources, to be good citizens, if nothing else. And leaving aside that we want people to adopt the same ideas that we have and come to the same conclusions and persuade them through reason, unlike oftentimes, I would argue, the other side. It is challenging because we live in this world of algorithms, and they have siloed us and put us in echo chambers. So there are positives and negatives to where we are. But getting off Twitter is probably a positive thing generally, I'd say.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I'll just close by saying, the alternatives to the legacy media don't look like what I think a lot of people expected them to look like or might think of them as. Like, Joe Rogan is kind of the new Walter Cronkite, as ridiculous as it sounds, because he's somebody that a wide swath of the country, I mean, he's bigger than just a niche, but he's somebody that a wide swath of the country actually trusts to bring them information. And that's not to say that people don't Google and get on the Wikipedia the stuff that Joe Rogan is talking about while they're listening to him on Spotify or watching on YouTube. They do. They know that Joe Rogan is not a reporter in the way that Walter Cronkite, an anchor, sort of purported to convey a neutral sort of concept of facts. And that concept of neutrality is exactly why these new alternatives don't look like what a lot of people expected them to look like. Because as my friend Sagar and Jetty always says, we fetishize the neutral, objective news media. And that's really only an invention of the era of mass media in the United States. That's something that happened when radio and television had to reach wide swaths of the country on a few channels, where their choices were a few channels, and they had to appeal to these massive audiences that weren't siloed off. The new era of alternatives to that are actually going to be sort of like opinion silos, and you just sort of have to do your own research and trust. But the next step to getting there and getting there healthily is pulling back the veil on these outlets that still purport to be doing what the legacy media purports to be doing when it comes to neutrality and objectivity. One quick question we got is, please explain, what is a Substack? Substack is an amazing new platform that lets really good people like Beckett Adams, Abigail Schreier, some of these folks who have left journalism outlets like Andrew Sullivan or Glenn Greenwald that no longer tolerated their sort of heterodox ideological positioning. It gives them a platform to send emails where people are breaking news. Barry Weiss, breaking news, telling interesting stories, doing cool reporting, doing cool journalism. And so you can subscribe and you'll get their content in your inbox whenever they send it on different at different intervals. But it's a great way to give some people the tools to be independent publishers and not have them be subservient to the corporate narrative. Do you have anything to add to that, Ben?
Yeah, it allows independent media commentators, journalists, and the like, you to have a direct relationship with them by subscribing to them, and you get their work delivered to your inbox. And it's a business model that works for Substack and that works for the content creators as well. And it allows you to essentially pay for the content that you want, not a whole bevy of content that hates your guts.
Yeah, exactly. Well said. On that note, we'll be back Friday, and we will be talking exactly about how that relationship between literal spies, PR outfits, and reporters perpetrated a massive hoax when it comes to Russian collusion and continues to yield results for the people who are trying to manipulate the larger narrative in this country. You've been watching Bad News. We are the media criticism show The Right Deserves. We're brought to you by the Federalist and the National Journalism Center. I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
We'll be back soon with more. And until then, make sure you